Alright, this is our video notes for the weekend of December 9th and 10th, 2017. We have to pick up with the Knights of Labor for 6 hours, then we're going to get pretty caught pretty quickly. We were saying on Thursday afternoon that the Knights of Labor were a group that preferred arbitration to strikes, and they wanted to create wider change to labor as a whole, but they were not really in favor of striking in general. The Knights of Labor got as big as 700,000 people. So the Knights of Labor got as big as 700,000 people in the mid-1880s. But the event that's going to bring them down is our next event, which is going to be the Haymarket bombing, or the Haymarket Square bombing, or whatever you want to call it, the Haymarket incident, whatever you want to refer to it as. So we're going to move to that one next. This is our next big major strike. So this one takes place outside of Chicago, essentially. There were thousands of Knights of Labor on strike or striking near Chicago on around May 1st, 1886. Well, police were sent to break up the strike. The police broke the strike up, but there was some police brutality, and so people got really upset about how the police handled the whole situation. So a few days later, I think it's like May 4th, they decided to protest in Chicago itself, in Haymarket Square, not striking this time, but actually protesting the police brutality. So that's where the event's going to take place. So right there at the beginning of May 1886, you're going to have some 80,000 Knights basically protesting inside of Chicago over this police brutality. There are also some anarchists there too. Anarchists in general also had some issues with, the way the government and everybody else treated them and so forth. So they were also protesting out there as well. So they were protesting for an 8-hour workday, but it did turn violent. On May 4th, when they held this meeting, police started to break it up again. So whenever it began to turn aggressive and violent with thousands of people there, the police show up again and begin to break it up. Well, while they're breaking it up, someone tossed a bomb, like an actual bomb, into the crowd, and it blew up, killing about 7 people, most of them policemen. So somebody threw this bomb in the crowd and killed 7 policemen. And so it led the police to directly go arrest some of these anarchists. They arrested 8 anarchists after the situation occurred, which they never, and we still to this day, we don't know who actually threw the bomb in Haymarket Square, but we do know that, we know it killed people, but we know essentially they didn't like anarchists, and so that's who they targeted. So they arrested these 8 people who they felt like were hazards to the community and so forth. And they had this trial. 7 were sentenced to death, and it was carried out. So 7 of the 8 guys they arrested do get executed and killed for their supposed bombing in Haymarket Square. So as a result, because of all the bad press around the Haymarket incident, the Knights of Labor are going to fall apart. They're going to go away. But the other big effect of all this is that many Americans are going to see labor unions as being violent and aggressive, and so that's going to hurt their abilities to recruit people and continue to get people to join their side or support them. So the Haymarket bombing is a big setback for labor, because you're seeing a lot of the negative press go against them as a result of what happened here. So the Knights fall apart, and the unions in general lose favor. The next major union is going to be the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, the American Federation of Labor. This one was formed and concentrated on obtaining practical economic goals. So as opposed to trying to do like big picture economic change or labor changes, they would try to focus on more obtainable goals, kind of factory per factory at a time. They're what we call a craft union. So the AFL is what we refer to as a craft union, which means that they organize people based on their craft. Like you have a union of carpenters, or a union of construction workers, or a union of painters, whatever the case may be. So this one actually was founded in the mid-80s, around the same time that the Knights kind of fell apart. They didn't have any kind of proposed reform program. They were not trying to change society. They just wanted to make the workplace better for the people who were in their unions. Their leader was a man named Samuel Gompers. Samuel Gompers, this man right here, he'll be the leader for the next 30, 40 years. He's around for quite a long time. But AFL, they were more focused on trying to get their workers higher wages and get their workers improved conditions, not trying to change and affect labor for the entire country, essentially. But they only recruited skilled workers as well. They did not recruit unskilled workers. They only targeted skilled workers, and that's it. They also really only targeted white males, so they weren't really that inclusive either. They only really went after skilled white males, not really anybody else. And their goals were to strike. Like their big, their way to, they felt the best way to achieve their goals was to go on strike, to address their issues. So they constantly went on strike, and they also collected large dues to be members of their union. That way, when their members were on strike, they could help provide them some kind of food or, some kind of basic allowance, essentially, to live on while they're on strike for long periods of time. By 1900, the AFL becomes America's largest union with 1 million members. And it's still around today in some form of itself. But in 1900, it becomes the largest union at 1 million members. They still never had any kind of major success, but they are one of the more effective unions. And like I said, they're still around even now. Okay, the next group of strikes is going to be in the 1890s. We're going to move on to the Homestead Strike. So this one actually happened at Carnegie Steel Plant in Pittsburgh whenever one of his managers cut wages. So at one of the Carnegie Steel Plants, 1892, one of the managers at the plants cuts wages by 20%. And Carnegie, when all this happened, kind of gave a mixed message. Like, he was very publicly supporting the workers, but at the same time, being the owner of the company, never did anything to really resolve the issue, and so the workers still had reduced wages. The managers used a lockout to keep the workers out of the factory, and then they also brought in scabs to work the factory in the meantime, which obviously led to, while the workers are on strike, essentially the Homestead Strike, they're very upset, very angry at all these scabs coming in and day out. Why call the Homestead Strike if it's located in Pittsburgh? It's actually located at this plant right outside of Pittsburgh in what's called Homestead, essentially, but it was at essentially a Pittsburgh steel industry. That's why it's called the Homestead Strike. Anyway, the strike went on for about 5 months. So during that time period, the company hired these private guards called the Pinkertons, Pinkerton. That's Pinkerton. And it's like Pinkerton Private Guard Company, essentially. They were hired to come out and monitor the strikers and protect the scabs. Well, violence does break out. There is fighting between the guards and the workers, and some people get killed. I want to say it was only like a handful, like around 10 or 12, but some folks do get killed. So after 5 months, the strike never worked out, and the strike has to be abandoned. And so the failure of this strike and its violence set the labor movement back in the steel industry quite somewhat until the 1930s, essentially. So the steel workers have to go back to work with nothing to show for it, where basically they're not going to get any major gains in their jobs until about the 1930s when the New Deal comes around. So again, you see the managers went out and not the laborers. The last strike, and probably the one that's most important, I guess, the one you see show up a lot, is the Pullman strike. So Pullman, this was a company outside of Chicago that made train cars, like sleeper cars for trains, other train cars too, but they were a fairly popular train car company. But the owner of the company, George Pullman, also had created this little town for his workers. Like, basically, he created a town for his factory and his workers. So not only was he their boss, but he was also their landlord. Like, all the houses in the area he owned, and so they had to pay him rent. Well, this is after the Panic of 1893. You see it happens a year later, 94. Well, because of the depression that's on, the recession, they have to, he decides to cut wages. So he cuts their wages, but he does not reduce their rent, which upsets a lot of the workers. So he announced a general wage cut, and he fined leaders who tried to negotiate, essentially, too. And so what forms during this strike is what's called the American Railway Union, the ARU. So this one is not a union you have to know for like any test, but it's an example. We call it an industrial union. So AFL is a craft union. The ARU is an industrial union, meaning that you don't organize people based on their skill. You organize everybody in that industry. So basically, every worker who works in the railroad company, people who lay the track, people who work on the cars, whatever the case is, everybody will be unionized within the actual industry itself of railroad making. So that's what the ARU represents. So anyway, the leader of this is a guy named Eugene V. Debs. Eugene V. Debs, this ball man right here, is the guy who ends up taking the leadership role of this. And we're going to see him a lot more in the future, so just kind of be aware of Eugene Debs. But he's the guy who is the leader of this new union that forms during the strike. So while they're striking, they also call for a general boycott. They call for a national boycott of Pullman cars. That way it can affect their profits. And so because people begin to boycott Pullman cars, it creates a lot of trains get kind of held up because no one's really using them, or they're being, they're not being operated because of the general boycott that's happening across the country. Other rail owners supported Pullman by attaching mail cars to his. That way the federal government had to get involved. So he just made basic sleeper cars, but once you had Pullman cars sitting there doing nothing, some other company owners brought in mail cars, meaning that they knew that the federal government was going to get involved, and that's exactly what happened. So the new president, President Grover Cleveland, here in '94, had to send out the military to intervene in the strike because, again, you don't have the mail running once the mail cars get attached. Also, too, what the federal government kind of used the Sherman Antitrust Act against them. So the federal government, through the court system, ruled that the union, the strike they were creating in this union they had formed was illegal based on the Sherman Antitrust Act, because they kind of label it like as a trust, essentially. And they said it was illegal, so they filed an injunction against them. So now the federal government has this injunction to use against the strikers, and the president comes out and uses his troops as well to break all this up. So after they failed to stop the strike, Debs and other leaders were arrested, and the strike was ended. And of course, there's violence again. Some people do get injured and killed. So there is some violence that breaks out with the soldiers who don't want to comply. So Debs goes to jail. Other leaders go to jail too. Most of the workers will not get their jobs back. So a lot of these guys get fired. And it's like I said, the Sherman Antitrust Act was used against them. The courts filed an injunction against them as well too. And so the whole thing was just a mess for the entire union and their people. So now the managers of factories also have a new tool to use as well, with the injunctions that they can get from the courts to kind of make it seem like these union groups could be dangerous and so forth. So again, another major setback. But one bright spot is that because Cleveland felt like the whole thing went very terribly and looked bad, he did help create a national Labor Day. So we get Labor Day in September because of this event, as kind of a make nice for the laborers and what happened with the Pullman strike. But that's where all that comes from. So Debs goes to jail, and while he's in jail, he becomes more radical, and he begins to become a socialist. So while he's in jail, Debs does become more radicalized. He adopts socialism, and when he leaves jail around 1900, he forms the first Socialist Party in America. So Debs was one of the founders of the American Socialist Party, which is going to run candidates for president and other offices too, but he's one of the founders. But you see such negativity towards unions by 1900 that only 3% of workers belong to unions at that time. So only about 3% of workers belong to unions at that time because there's so much negativity around them over this period. All right, last couple things on this slide. Mother Mary Harris Jones is next. She originally worked for the Knights of Labor, and she tried to help unionize and protect the mine workers. In the 1890s, she got this nickname Mother Jones. So her name's Mary Harris Jones. She was like an Irish immigrant, but she got the nickname Mother Jones. In 1902, she successfully organized mine workers and their families against mine owners. So she was a union organizer, helping to organize mine workers. But probably the most famous thing that she did was in 1903, she organized a children's march for children who worked in factories, who marched from Philadelphia to New York City, which is where Theodore Roosevelt's from, to create awareness for the lax child labor laws in different states. So her marches did a lot to create awareness of all the problems, because a lot of these kids that she's marching are dirty. Some of them already have injuries. They like are on crutches, may have injuries, like they may have lost limbs or lost fingers. And so a lot of this is to create awareness. Some states do adopt child labor laws, like Pennsylvania will adopt child labor laws because of her efforts. She also goes on to be very radical herself. She ends up also helping to form the Socialist Party alongside Eugene Debs, too. And then lastly, you have this other union you need to be aware of, the IWW, or the Industrial Workers of the World. This is the last union you have to be aware of. So the main three you have to know are the Knights, the AFL, and the Industrial Workers of the World, IWW. This one's formed around 1905 by Debs. So Debs and other socialists, anarchists, radicals, Marxists, they were too radical for the AFL, and they wanted more radical changes, and so they formed their own union with the IWW around 1905. They were also called the Wobblies, W-O-B-B-L-I-E-S. So they weren't trying to organize workers just based on their craft or their industry. They were trying to organize workers across the globe, hence the name Workers of the World. They wanted all workers around the entire world to unite together and basically change their governments and so forth. So very socialist, even borderline communist. They wanted solidarity among workers, the working class, against the employing class, and organize around the globe, not based on some kind of trade. They also welcome African Americans, women, and Asians. So they welcome lots of other groups like African Americans, women, and Asians. They favored general strikes. By 1920s, they only had about 40,000 people. Because they were so radical with their socialist ideas, they only ever had about 40,000 at their total. And in the 1920s, there's a lot of anti-socialist, anti-communist feelings, and so they will kind of fall apart by the end of the decade. But it was an effort to try to like organize workers across the globe, not just based on one trade or the other. So we're going to stop our first video there, and we'll go to the next.